Okay, we are live.
We are.
And welcome to Mentionables Live. Tonight, we take a look at Peter Boghossian, Anthony Magnabosco, and all things street epistemology related. So stick around. It's going to be a fun discussion. I'm Caleb Johnston. With me tonight. Yeah, there you go. Do that again.
All right. I'm Joel Furches.
All right. Now we're all set without me cutting you off.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Glad to have you with me tonight, Joel. It's good that we're doing one of these, like you said, mono shows again.
Yeah, what's up with that?
I don't know. We hadn't done one of these in a while. Clinton's always been around, so but I know he's got some stuff going on, so hopefully he'll be back with us soon.
Sure,
I
yeah.
did.
Clinton's moving, as I hear. Or
Yes.
Move Ed.
Yes. Also, though, I know that just last night, I believe it aired, that he had a debate over hell, the subject of hell. I believe it was over on Capturing Christianity's
That's
page.
right.
So be sure
I knew
to
he was
go.
doing the debate, but it slipped my mind that it was Capturing Christianity.
Yeah. So I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. Yeah,
Oh, okay,
it at least aired yesterday. So it's on my list. Haven't had a chance to watch it yet, though. But
me either.
Go check that out. All right. So let's dive in. You want to tell our listeners what we're talking about tonight?
Sure. So I don't think this has ever been brought up before, but I researched deconversion.
No.
Yeah, it's true.
Wow.
And as a result of that, it occurred to me at some point that I should probably look into Peter Boghossian's A Manual for Creating Atheists, which is a pretty bold title. And if it is indeed a manual for creating atheists, it would have some informative things to say to an individual like myself who studies deconversion. Because if he has, in fact, discovered techniques for deconverting people, then knowing about the ins and outs of these techniques would tell me a lot about the deconversion process.
Right.
Especially some of the things that build to or trigger that deconversion process. Now, I'll put it this way. I was skeptical. I felt that that was too bold a claim to say that you had a manual that, if properly implemented, would deconvert people. And especially with the nature of street epistemology, which is sort of the atheist version of street evangelism, which it's when a person makes a cold approach to somebody out in sort of a public area and then engages them in a conversation with the intention of switching them to their side. In the case of evangelism, to quote unquote save the person or make them a Christian. And in the case of street epistemology, to deconvert them, convince them that their religion is not true. Now, before I go into that a bit, did you want to give your take on that?
No.
Okay.
You covered it pretty well. So I've got some experience with this sort of thing. So it'll be fun to chat about as we go down this road.
I had an individual who friended me on Facebook and proceeded to sort of post and implement street epistemology to the best of his capability. I don't think he was very capable, but you could see that he was trying. And you got to give him an
good. Got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah. And so my experience with street epistemology has only been through individuals, usually on social media, who are trying to kind of implement these strategies. And I've never been terribly impressed. Now, I had just said something about convincing a person out of their religion. Boghossian, in his book, makes a distinction between religion and faith. Religion, he says, has more to do with community, more to do with practices. It's it's a community that you belong to, and it's certain rituals or practices that you undertake. And faith is the bane of his existence. This is the single point around which the entire book revolves, is his hatred of faith. Now, hatred may be incorrect, but he believes that it's a very destructive force, and he believes that it should be combated at all costs. And he goes into some of those costs in the book. For instance, he believes that obviously we should start taxing churches and religious organizations. That's a big deal. We must do that. But one of the most interesting things that he advocates for is adding faith to the catalog of mental diseases. There is a catalog in psychology of sort of psychoses, and he wants faith to be added to that catalog. And he was saying that unironically. He was actually serious about that. So this should give you some idea of his feelings towards faith. Now, the next part is how he defines faith, because this is sort of crucial to the argument.
That's just what I was getting ready to ask.
Before I get into his definition of faith, Cale, why don't you hit us with your definition of faith? What do you think faith means?
Right. So to go an unintellectual route with this and just give kind of my personal definition I would give to somebody is faith is actually taking a step towards something. So you can look at a bridge, you can see that it looks sturdy, but when you take the step onto that bridge or past the point where you can no longer reach the side, then that would be how I would describe faith. It's taking action with trust in something, or it could be lack of trust in something, but it's actually taking the action to say that I put my trust in this or that, whether it be a bridge or whether it be a deity.
Okay. So, yeah, and that's typically what you would get from the religious community, is that faith is more synonymous with trust than it is with sort of a blind obedience, and that trust would typically be based on some kind of background knowledge. So, for instance, the biblical definition of faith that everyone runs to would be Hebrews 11:1, which says approximately that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I don't know which translation I'm pulling that from. That's just from my memory. But and that's all well and good. There's a lot to unpack in that, because he uses the words evidence and he uses the words hope and substance. So there's a lot of words that you'd want to look into the Greek and figure out exactly what he's saying there, because to me that's not a crystal clear statement.
Right.
If I said faith equals trust, that's a fairly clear statement. But the statement that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, especially in Greek, substance has a lot of, more meaning to it, because if you look into sort of the Greek philosophy, substance was a term that had a lot of philosophical depth to it. And who knows? At any rate, I bring that up because in Hebrews 11, after that definition in the first verse, he goes on to give this long list of individuals who were rewarded for their faith despite a lot of trial and tribulation. They went through a hard time, but they remained faithful, and they received a reward for that faith at the end. So, in the larger context of that book, the author of the book is talking to a church who is under persecution. And so when he makes the statement and then gives this long list of people who went through a hard time and were faithful and endured to the end and then got a reward, he's doing so for a very specific purpose. He's talking to people who are going through a hard time, and he's essentially saying, hey, here's a lot of evidence from history that people who remain faithful in a hard time are rewarded in the end. So, in a sense, that the book that gives that definition then goes on to give evidence. So,
Right.
but that's sort of besides the point of what we're talking about. No, for Boghossian, faith means, first of all, he uses two definitions. The one which is entirely predictable would be the sort of blind adherence to something without any sort of evidence. So, trust in a sense, but trust without evidence.
Right.
It's as if you approach that bridge blindfolded, did an Indiana Jones and stuck your foot out and stepped just hoping for the best. That kind of faith. So, I mean, this is typically what you get from the skeptical world to a degree. This is just the idea of faith as in blind belief. But then he gives his second definition for faith, and this is really the kicker for his argument and for his dislike of faith in general. And his second definition is that faith is pretending to know things that you don't. So he suggests for his readers that every time they hear faith, they replace it with the words pretending to know something you don't. So, if I have faith in the scriptures, I pretend to know things that I don't about the scriptures. If I have faith in the, salvation of Christ, I pretend to know things I don't know about the salvation of Christ. Essentially.
I pretend to know things that I don't about my wife.
There you go. Yeah. And he doesn't he feels that putting, using faith in that sense is a conflation because presumably you know something about your wife. And so therefore it's not sort of a blind trust or any of the definitions of faith. Now, in his book, he believes that religious people conflate faith with hope. And so he spends a good amount of time showing how faith is different than hope, which is interesting because that's not the comparison or the, definition that I would have confused between faith.
Right,
and hope.
exactly.
Hope is a completely different thing. But for him, apparently that's the mix-up in people's mind, is that faith is the same thing as hope. And I suppose that he does that because, it's interesting. He gives sort of a counter-apologetic chapter, but the things he's countering, I soon discovered as I read the chapter, were the sorts of things that a man on the street would say if you were confronting them about their beliefs. And one of the things that apparently they say would be, why would you sort of challenge my faith when it is the thing that gives meaning to my life? It's the thing that gets me through my day. And I think that's where he comes up with the faith-hope comparison.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a little more sense then, coming from that perspective. Okay.
Yeah. So a good deal of the book is spent talking about how bad faith is. This is a large book, and I got it in order to see the techniques he was going to use in order to sort of deconvert people. And not a lot of it was about those techniques. A lot of it was about, the importance of challenging faith and, ways to socially advocate against faith and the damages that faith does. Basically a lot of it was how bad faith is, how terrible faith is. And then a little bit of it was devoted to, but it's interesting because he legitimately thinks, at least based on the book, and it seems really sincere in the book, that street epistemology and the work that he does is an intervention for sick people. You are giving them treatment, and this is the terms that he uses. He uses terms like giving them doses of treatment. So like you revisit them after you put this, stone in their shoes, something to consider. You come back and you give them different treatments, and you follow up until such a time as they have successfully jettisoned the cancer of the mind, which is faith.
And see, I wouldn't fully disagree with that in every sense, because I certainly attempt to do the same thing with cultists and people I encounter who are in these fringe dangerous groups. But it seems to make no distinction between religion and cult. If you're really going to say broadly that this is treatment for people, it seems.
Yeah, no, I mean, it would be interesting to me then to see what your take on the book would be, because in a sense, you're doing something similar to things that we as Christians believe are false. So that's an interesting take on that because, obviously religions are somewhat exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
They can all be wrong, but they can't all be right, kind of thing. So, and despite the nature of this show and the circles in which we travel, there's more to apologetics and Christianity than just countering atheism.
Right, exactly. And I think, one thing, and maybe it's a way we could pull in a definition that Boghossian might actually agree with, would be wanting to know as many true things as possible. I think he would probably agree that the best thing we can do is know as many true things as possible. We may differ on what we think some of those things are, but still the goal when dealing with people, I think I try and use this when dealing with strangers as well as friends, is the goal is to know as much truth as possible, whether it's about the situation we're dealing with or whether it's about things that, matter in the grand scale of eternity. It's important to know true things. So, I definitely get where he's coming from.
Okay, so that was a really good point to bring up because in terms of coming to know true things, he would, especially given that part of his definition of faith is pretending to know things that you don't, he sees faith as an epistemology. Now, for our listeners, in case you don't know, epistemology basically means the way in which you come to know a thing. So, if you consider it from his perspective, he's saying that we come to believe things are true. We come to know truth by means of faith, which by his definition is pretense. We come to know things are true by pretending that they're true or pretending we know them, or alternately by sort of blind adherence to things that we don't have faith or have evidence for. So that being that he sees faith as an epistemology, which I don't think faith is the way that you come to knowledge in things. I think faith is a consequence of knowledge or an approach to things that you know, but it is not itself an epistemology. And
Right.
that's where the difference comes in. He believes faith to be an epistemology. And so when you come to him and say, well, it's important to know as many true things as possible, he'd totally agree. But then he'd say that you are pretending to know things you don't because you come to know things by means of faith.
Yeah, that's really frustrating.
Yeah. And so I think that if we could, disenchant a street epistemology from this notion that faith is itself an epistemology, then that might be an approach to take. But let me ask you this. How accurate do you think it is that religious people, at least sometimes, utilize faith as an epistemology? Do you think that ever happens, or is that a
Mm.
complete
Mm.
red herring?
I would say that's pretty prevalent.
Okay.
If I had to guess, now, in general, that's when your typical Christian is confronted with things that may challenge them. Now, I don't think I think they use it as an excuse occasionally. I don't think they use it as an epistemology. Maybe that clarifies what I'm trying to say. I think they use it as an excuse rather often, but I don't think it's used as an epistemology because I believe most people, regardless of what they're going to say or use faith as an excuse to get out of a difficult situation or a difficult question, doesn't necessarily mean that when they go back and really do think about that and why they believe what they do, they're going to use other means to research and investigate uh, versus what they may put on as a public display. Does that make sense?
Okay, I think I get what you're saying. Um, Depending on your definition of faith, and he makes a big deal about the whole "I don't have enough faith to be an atheist" thing. Um, Entirely ignorant, of course, that that's a polemic. It's
Right.
using the it's using this sort of definition of faith as a blind trust in something, um, and throwing it back in that direction to say that there's a sort of blind trust which is involved in atheism, and I don't have that level of blind trust. Not that we believe that that's the actual definition
Right.
of
Exactly.
faith. It's a polemic. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but he doesn't catch the fact that it's a polemic. He thinks that that's actually a argument that religious people are making, that I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Faith being pretending to things you know things you don't.
Mm.
So yeah, there's a lot of bantering about the definition of faith. And actually, if you go back and listen to the conversation that Boghossian had with Tim McGrew on the Unbelievable forum, then most of that conversation was spent arguing about the definition of faith. They barely got off of that argument. So yeah, that's really the key to tying together his entire book, is this definition of faith that he has. All right, so when it comes to the actual practice of street epistemology, it turns out that street epistemology is basically the Socratic method warmed over. And again, he spends very little time talking about the actual technique. But when he does, he just sort of brings up the Socratic method. For listeners who aren't familiar with the Socratic method, essentially, the Socratic method is questioning back along a person's a line of reasoning. It's a more sophisticated technique of a strategy my daughter uses on me, where I tell her something and she asks why, and I answer the why question and she asks why. And so I tell her why the answer to the why question was what it was, and she asks why. At that point, I have to tell her why the answer to the why question was the why, you know. And eventually, if she asks why back enough, she exposes the fact that I don't have a reason for everything. That at some point things boil down to a tautology, or an assumed truth that I can't justify outside of it. And so that's the Socratic method. That's a very unsophisticated version of the Socratic method.
I like you putting it that way.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. So basically, that's what he asked to do. A religious person makes a statement, say, that God loves me. All right. So then the street epistemologist would ask something along the lines of, well, how did you come to know that God loved you? And then the Christian might say, well, I feel it in my heart, or, well, I read in the Bible, or, something along those lines, at which point they would question whether feeling it in your heart was a good method of being assured that that was the case, or if you might, in fact, be mistaking feelings, which is possible. Or reading it in the Bible, that's an easy one. You just question the validity of the Bible as a method of coming to know something, as an epistemology, if you will. And so tying this back into my deconversion research, the one thing that really struck me, and this is when I've seen street epistemology in practice, That's not so much what I got out of his book, but when I've actually seen it done, this is a technique that I see almost every time I've seen street epistemology, and that is that the individual practicing the epistemology will ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in the thing you just said?
Right.
Or, another way around, do you believe that faith is the best way to come to know that with confidence? So there's this real stress on confidence. They really want to bring out, press that point of confidence. This, I think, is the real key to the deconversion research that I've done. And that is that people who deconvert tend to come from a background that stresses high confidence. You
Mm,
know, you have to be confident, and confidence is the sign, right, that God gives us that we're true. We have that confidence in our heart. If we have said the sinner's prayer, we can be 100% confident that we're going to heaven. Or you got to have confidence in the Word of God in the Scriptures. And so this is stressed over and over again in certain religious environments. And so when challenged on that confidence, um, this is a real key, a very effective method of pushing the person towards deconversion based on what I've my research, because this lack of confidence, the second you challenge that confidence and the person is forced to think, hey, maybe I'm not fully confident on this. And none of us are fully confident on anything. If I demand that you tell me whether you're confident that your doctor has your best interest at heart, there's always that chance that your doctor doesn't have your best interest at heart, no matter how much you
right.
trust your
Right.
doctor. Nobody has 100% confidence on anything, and therefore, when the street epistemologist is standing in front of you demanding total confidence, and then you are aware, if this was your pastor, a person from your church, and they were asking, how confident are you in your faith? It would be super easy to say, oh, I'm 100% confident. And then conversation over. Everything's good. But when the
Right.
person standing in front of you is a skeptic, you know that the second you say you're 100% confident, they're going to challenge that. And when
Hmm.
you know that they're going to challenge it, you yourself begin to question it. But here's the key. Once you've questioned your confidence, you've proven that you don't have confidence. Because the act of questioning, am I 100% confident, is in itself doubt, unconfidence. The only way that you can show you're 100% confident is the second that question leaves his lips, like, yeah, yep, 100% confident. If you have to stop and pause and think about it, you're not 100% confident. And they know that. So
Right.
this, if you come from a religious background which stresses high confidence, this insistence that the street epistemologist has on how confident are you that XYZ is such an effective technique. So this is something I noticed in the practice of street epistemology. I don't remember seeing a lot of stressed in the book. So that must be a technique that was come up by another source of street epistemology or has developed external to the book, but
Hmm.
very effective.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that with Anthony Magnabosco.
Mhm.
On a lot of his videos, he definitely uses the percentage thing. I believe he credits Boghossian, but yeah, if
Maybe
that's
I
not
missed that
part of the
part of the
book.
book.
No, I mean I've seen that same disconnect in some of the sources I've looked at.
Mhm. So yeah, that's the part that impressed me when I watched Street Epistemology in action, and it's actually one of the things that made me want to read the book, because I saw that as connecting to my research as a very effective technique. And I was like, well, maybe there is something to this, because they've tapped into at least one thing that I've found in my research. Maybe they've found more things than that. So then I read the book and I was a little disappointed. It didn't spend a lot of time on technique at all. It gave a brief primer on the Socratic Method, and then spent most of the book telling why it's important to practice street epistemology.
Well, was it successful? Is this something you're going to go out and do now?
Street epistemology?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not entirely confident in my ability to do so.
Yeah. What kind of percentage would you put on that?
Ooh, that's a good one. About 30. I'd give it 30%.
30%?
Oh, you
All
said
right.
scale of 1 to 10. Sorry. 3.
3. Okay. All right. And after this conversation, how confident are you going to be?
Honestly, I do utilize the Socratic method from time to time. I find that there's not a great deal of difference between using the Socratic method to cause a person to doubt the things that they hold to be true, and at least my version of presuppositionalism, which is this idea that when you question back along your reasons for things, you actually have to arrive at the fact that there are fundamental presuppositions that we all hold in order to reason from. So, the classic one would be morality. How do we know a thing is right or wrong? You question back long enough, you have to realize that there is a presupposition of morality that we all operate off of. We presuppose that there is a right and wrong. We may not always agree on which things are right and which things are wrong, but we all agree that there is such a thing as right or wrong. And that is not a conclusion that we arrived at by way of study and reasoning. That is more a conclusion that we've arrived at that we never arrived at. Um, it was something that we hold fundamentally as humans. Other presuppositions that we all hold are confidence in things like logic. And when I talk about logic, I'm talking about things like the um, law of non contradiction, that A can't be both A and not A at the same time in the same way. This is one of the most fundamental laws of reasoning, and you could say a lot of reason is built off of that. And so, when I do presupposition, I think some presuppositionalism is based on this notion that we have to presuppose the truth of the Bible in order to operate. And that's one thing. That's not my version of presuppositionalism. My version is basically that there are fundamental truths that we all presuppose in order to think, reason, and operate as human beings. And once we expose those fundamental truths, then we have to. It works better if we have some kind of mind, universal mind, that holds all abstracts together, than if there is no such thing. So that's how I use the Socratic method.
No, I agree with you there on that difference in terms of presuppositionalism, because I've definitely noticed the same just with people like Bruggencate, who kind of use this, start with the Bible versus starting with certain axioms that we find to be true. So yeah, definitely see that.
Yeah, I know where the sort of Bible presuppositionalists are coming from. It's kind of a Romans 1 thing, that sort of everybody has a knowledge of God, and that they are working against this knowledge of God that we all hold when they attempt to, I don't know, operate outside of that knowledge or whatnot. And I have made arguments for a sort of sensus divinitatis from research. Things about the fact that you find, when you boil it down, that human beings from practically birth have this sense of sort of unseen agency in the world, and also the sense that things exist and are for a purpose. And so there's this sort of fundamental sense of design that kind of comes with us as human beings. Um, and so, I mean, this can tie into a sort of sensus divinitatis, that and in addition to the fact that there's not an individual in history or geography that you couldn't express the idea of God to, and they know what you're talking about to some degree or another. So this idea of God is sort of fundamental. Now, we all would disagree on what God is like, yes, but we also understand this concept of sort of an all powerful unseen agent.
No, right. Yeah, I remember when we discussed that previously.
Yeah, I've revised my thinking on that somewhat because I've realized that this concept of unseen agency may result in a sort of fundamental intuition towards God, but it also results in the belief that there are mischievous pixies around your house when you can't find your keys. Um, and the idea that, you know, my car broke down because it hates me. Um, and, just various
That
things.
may actually be a fact, but
But yeah, I mean, it's not just it doesn't immediately leap to a belief in God. It leaps to a belief in a variety of unseen agents in the world. Um, the idea that there's invisible dragons beneath the ground that give us feng shui and different things like that. There are other unseen agencies that people evolve towards in their beliefs that don't involve an all-powerful mind.
right.
So I'm not sure if I can label that sensus divinitatis when it does result in a variety of non-God beliefs.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you on that one.
No, I might have to rethink my ideas on that because you can see what I mean when I say that, this idea of unseen agency has resulted in a number of beliefs that are not God beliefs.
Right, right. And that is a problem. If you were going to be using this as an argument.
Yeah, as an argument or sensus divinitatis. Now, I
Mm-hmm.
think that we could still argue to sensus divinitatis, but this recognition that we all have um, the intuition towards unseen agency does not itself make a proof of sensus divinitatis.
So maybe I don't want to drag us away from this too quick, but to pull back in with the discussion on the book and street epistemology a little bit.
Yeah,
So
yes, let's.
You said you can see why this is effective in terms of particularly looking at confidence and how it attacks someone's confidence level.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, I know we've maybe touched on this before some in regards to apologetics, but what if the whole thing were flipped around in terms of inoculating somebody, if you will, or having discussions that challenge them in such a way as to build up their confidence in Christianity, for example?
I think that that's the wrong approach, and I'll tell you why. The evolution of myself as a person in the pew to apologist has involved a drift towards a healthy agnosticism. And what I mean by a healthy agnosticism is a recognition that I, in fact, could be wrong about things, and therefore I should. Agnosticism, the definition is that I cannot for certain know whether a thing is true or not. Now, I don't take that approach with every piece of information in my life, but there are things that I think it is wise to remain agnostic about. One of the most fundamental for me is the subject of origins. I cannot, I don't have the expertise in biology or geography or astronomy to argue for one version of origins or another. Um, there are some very convincing arguments on both sides, and there's some not so convincing arguments that I can't counter because I don't have the expertise to do so. And I find that this particular discussion is not crucial either to my life or to my beliefs. And so, in that sense, I remain agnostic. It's possible that in the future, a certain amount of evidence or line of reasoning will convince me that one or the other is true, and that's fine. I'm more than happy to entertain that, but I don't immediately remain confident, take a position, plant my flag, and then become confident of that position. I think that that is a pathway towards a shaking of my epistemology, let's say. So, yeah, and this is another way of putting that is intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is defined as the recognition that there are things you may be wrong about, that you do not yourself contain all of the knowledge or expertise to be confident about the things that you know. And so, open to the fact, open to the idea of learning new things, of learning that you're wrong about things. So this is intellectual humility. It's the understanding that you have intellectual limits, and that is opposed to intellectual confidence, which is the belief that you don't have such limitations, that you can be sure about X, Y, or Z. And I think to a degree you see, well, okay, yeah. You see a lot of the same dogmatic thinking on the atheist side that you see on the fundamentalist Christian side. And I
Right.
think that this is at least partially a result of the fact that a lot of your atheists actually come from fundamentalist Christianity. And so they take the same epistemological approach, they transport it over to atheism that they once had in Christianity. And that includes this sort of healthy confidence that everything you believe is unquestioningly true, and those who disagree are kind of stupid for doing so. So, yeah, when I say that our counter should not be to build confidence, what I mean is our counter should be to exercise intellectual humility, because in exercising humility, you also recognize that it's not wise for the your interlocutor, the person at the opposite end of the table, to be as confident as they are. That they're not recognizing their own intellectual limitations, and this makes it easier to, well, to maintain some of your confidence, because you realize that this person is being a little overstepping their intellectual limitations.
So would it be fair to say that street epistemology therefore has a positive effect, regardless, because it's going to enforce or influence intellectual humility in people?
Well, I would hope so. Although, I mean, the goal of street epistemology is to take this person who's confident in Christianity and transport them to a person who's confident against Christianity. So that confidence doesn't go away, it just flips. And so, street epistemology, if it's effective, doesn't make an intellectually humble person. It makes a person who had the same degree of intellectual arrogance just on the other side of the fence. So what I mean, the advantage of street epistemology is that it um, sort of serves as a vaccine within the Christian body, because it is a challenge that the church would have to evolve in order to um, sort of bear through that particular storm. And that evolution is never a bad thing, because one of the things that I have found in my work in apologetics is that I have grown more by engaging atheists and their arguments than I have by remaining sort of uh, insulated within my bubble.
No, absolutely. I concur 100% on that, because when you are even repeating versions of arguments. You are not always following someone's thought process through things. You're following your thought process through them. But to actually engage somebody and actually listen to what they're saying, you're engaging their thought process and how they're coming to the conclusions they are versus just your own processes, which may already be fairly well determined as to how you go about through an argument.
So, the power of a straw man is that, um, properly utilized, and I use the term properly in quotation marks there, a straw man lures a person into defending a position that they did not actually hold. And so it defines their position for them, and then it makes them defend that position. And that works sometimes. You know,
Right.
it's not always the case that a person says, "Well, you're pretending to know things you don't know," and the person doesn't come back with, no, I know them by and then because they in saying that, faith is pretending you know things you don't know, it shifts the ball from, faith is sort of exercising trust in things that I do know, to faith is how I come to know things. And so 2 seconds prior to walking into that conversation, the Christian did not think of faith as an epistemology. They didn't think of faith is how I know that XYZ are true. They would have
Right.
come to those conclusions by something outside of faith. But when the street epistemologist says, "Do you think that faith is a good way of coming to know things for certain?" They suddenly have to defend the notion that faith is a good way of coming to know things for certain. At which point they start to believe that they use faith as a method, as an epistemology, and then they realize that their use of faith as an epistemology, which they didn't have 30 seconds ago, is really bad, and bam, they're an atheist. So that's the power of the straw man. It pushes your opponent into, it forces them to defend a position they did not actually hold.
Like a really good magic trick.
Exactly. There you go. So, and that's one of the reasons why it's important to be able to spot a straw man, because if you don't, you end up getting pulled into a rhetorical trick that you can't get out of.
Right, because it's an argument that's already been set against you.
Yep. So, yeah. Now, in terms of epistemology, if I were to be honest, I would say that I came to believe that Christianity was true through some combination of intuition and being taught that by authority figures when I was a child. All right. And that's easy enough to argue against because, I have said in the past that most, if not all, of the people I've studied who deconverted were raised in the church and had been Christian since they were children. So if you were to confront a person such as I or them and ask, "Why are you a Christian?" they can't really identify a moment in their life when they became a Christian. They've just sort of always been that by default. And so because they don't have that conversion moment when they can say, I used to be this and then I became that. I mean, most people who grew up in the church can always identify, well, there was this moment that I came to a altar call, or, my Sunday school teacher did have us say the sinner's prayer, and they've got this vague sort of moment that they can think of that they became a Christian for sure, but they were never not a Christian. They didn't transition from being one thing to being a Christian. They transitioned from being a Christian to being a slightly more committed Christian. Um, and so, yeah, there's that. So this is how I was raised as well. I'm a prime candidate for deconversion. Woo. Um, but
Welcome to the
the
club.
yeah, the way in which I came to believe that Christianity was true is different from the way in which I sustained that belief. You know, children eventually become adolescents, eventually become adults, and you can see that there is almost always a rejection of certain childhood notions as the person grows and finds their own identity. And so, there's this sort of notion that Christians are brainwashed to be Christians when they're children. Um, and I mean, they're taught to be Christians. So, to a degree, depending on your definition of brainwashing, there's some validity in that. But in the other hand, we have studies that show that a person's religiosity as a child is not a good predictor of their religiosity as an adult. Um, so just because you were raised as a Christian doesn't in any way ensure that you will remain a Christian when you transition into adulthood. Now, that does not mean that you're going to become an atheist. It probably just means that you're going to stop attending church and caring about religious things. You're going to be a person who's like, yeah, I mean, I went to church as a kid. My parents took me there, uh, but now I go biking on the weekends or something. They have better things to do on the weekends now, and they haven't taken a position as an atheist, but they're not a Christian anymore. So anyway, yeah. So I was talking about sustaining beliefs. I think you and I both have a instance in our adult lives where we began to have to seek sort of reasons and evidence to remain Christians rather than simply relying on what we were told as children. Now,
Right.
as children, there wasn't a bit of faith involved because we trusted our parents or the authority figures around us. Because as a child, what else are you going to do? You haven't learned the scientific method. You can't read more than a Dr. Seuss book, so you can't really go in and do the research. You are sort of restricted by your intellectual capacities and life experience to trust those individuals who are adults around you. And so at that point in your life, most of the things that you learn, you trust because they came from trusted authority figures. And so there's an element of faith there if by faith you mean trust. And then when
Right. I mean, but at the same time, we all have that certain degree of trust, especially when it's in anything outside of our immediate field of expertise or knowledge. We rely on somebody else or some other piece of information that gives us a lot of our knowledge. We have to trust certain people, or if we don't, we don't learn much of anything. Does that here? You see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's kind of the direction I was going as well. Is that I mean, there is a degree of faith in most things that we know, because most of the things that we know we're told. I can observe things around me in my immediate vicinity, but things that are not in my immediate vicinity I have to observe through other means, and often those means are through media. I'm looking at some screen or other which is giving me information about things that are not around me, and there's a degree to which I trust that the information I'm being given on that screen is accurate. 50 years ago, when my grandfather opened the morning paper and read an article, I doubt that he immediately became skeptical about the article. He probably just went ahead and believed that what he was reading was, in fact, true. Versus nowadays, when I open the internet and I see an article, a news article, I instantly doubt it, and I question whether or not the information I'm being given in that article is in fact true.
Unless it's the Babylon Bee. Babylon Bee, I believe straight up, no doubt, every single thing's true. Yeah.
No, and that's because there's been a shift in the way in which information is communicated and controlled, to the degree that I can read the same article from two different sides of the fence and get entirely different views about what actually happened. And having that knowledge in my mind, I realized that probably the information being filtered to me does not accurately reflect what actually happened through either news source. So, yeah, so that has lost an element. The media has lost an element of trust over time. The media that my grandfather trusted, he trusted far more than the media that I trust.
Right, right. No, absolutely.
So,
I
yeah,
think that's undeniable.
right. And so that's what we mean when we talk about faith as trust, is that, there is an element of experience that allows us to trust or not a source of information. So, I mean, when I read a Wikipedia article, I typically tend to trust what I'm reading. Today I was reading about the North American black rat snake, and it gave me its habitat and its feeding, techniques and different effects about it. And I don't think there was any point at which I went, wait a minute, how do I know that thing eats both rats and frogs? It's called a rat snake.
I've
Wake up, people.
Okay, quick story here.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, we had a frog outside of our house. This was an outdoor pet, as many of our pets were
Oh, it was a
growing up
pet
in the
frog.
country. Right. Well, outdoor pet frog. He just stayed in one spot all the time.
Oh,
He had 3 legs. So we named him 3 Legs, or
that's an odd
Tripod.
number of legs for a
Tripod
frog to
was the
hold.
name I think we went with. Yeah. Well, we had a pet rat snake as well that lived outside. And one day, this snake looked very, very bulbous in its middle.
I
And so
cannot see where the story is
the
going at
obvious
all.
thing to do was, to play with the snake, obviously, because I mean that's what you do when you find a snake.
Yeah.
Um, well, he got a little upset. His dinner came back up, and we found out what happened to 3 Legs and why we hadn't seen him for a while. So
Is he still alive?
no, he was half digested.
I was hoping this ended with a happy ending.
No, he was in respiratory failure at the time, I think. So
Probably.
getting eaten by a snake would be a slow, miserable death.
Yeah, it's among the reasons. It's among the ways in which I don't want to die. Actually, any reptile eating me, I'm fairly sure, except a dinosaur. Dude,
That
if
would
I
be
got
quick.
eaten by a dinosaur,
That would be cool. I could live with that. I mean, well, not really.
See what you did there.
Yeah.
But think about it. That's an epic way to go. I mean, maybe it hurts, but on my tombstone,
It's not going to
Joel
hurt for
Perkins,
long.
eaten by a T-Rex. Metal.
That would be cool.
Yeah. Anyway.
Unless, yeah, that was a bad rabbit trail. That went a long way off the path.
Circling back around, my point was I had faith in Wikipedia when I read that. I did not doubt what I was reading. Now, I brought up Wikipedia because if I were a college professor and some of my student turned in a paper in which they cited Wikipedia, suddenly my level of faith in Wikipedia would be a great deal less than it was when I read about North American black rat snakes.
Right. Different degrees of trust depending on different degrees of product that you're looking for.
Right. So in his book, Boghossian, parroted Christians as saying things like, well, you have faith in science. Now, given his definition of faith, that would be easy to rebut because, faith being pretending to know things I don't know, you could show how the things which I know about science have sources other than my own make believe. But the point stands if we talk about it in terms of trust. If I happen to be the sort of person whose epistemology is based around science and science has given results which are reliable in some sense in the past, then I trust in it. But if we define faith as trust, then I have faith in it. So again, it's all about the definition. We're operating off the idea that faith means trust. He's operating off of the idea that faith means either blind adherence and or pretending to believe things that I don't actually have the ability to proof.
Yeah, without that definition holding up, it kind of creates a problem for the whole shebang.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where the straw man thing comes in, because if the street epistemologist approaches you and says that faith is pretending to know things that you don't know, then you either have to accept their definition or argue against it, and they're equipped to sustain the argument that you would have against that. Um, they are equipped to come back and say, well, no, this is why faith means pretending to know things you don't know. And this is, in fact, a thing that you do. You pretend to know things you don't know. And then they'll use the confidence approach. You believe that the Bible is inerrant. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in that belief? And then proceed from there. I think by the end of this episode, our listeners will be able to practice street epistemology themselves.
That would be the hope, right? Or maybe not.
Yeah. Well, in terms of a book for my personal research, I was disappointed. It did not give me techniques. In fact, like I said, I don't remember him doing the confidence thing in that book.
Did it give any research or background as to why this approach was chosen? Like,
why it was chosen?
Right. Like, was there any research that went into using street epistemology? Have there been any studies or surveys to show that this actually works? Or
he operated off of personal experience. It
okay.
was anecdotal.
Okay.
He was ensured the reader that it did work because he's been doing it for many, many years, and he's gotten results. And so it was anecdotal. There was no study cited. And as I said, the book was more about showing how bad a thing faith was, how corrosive and damaging it to the individual and society faith was, and the necessity of weeding it out and getting rid of it by any means possible, short of executing people. But definitely prove that they're psychotic by putting faith in the, manual of psychoses.
Right. And maybe Boghossian has grown some. I've read his more recent book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. It was better, I think, in terms of just the overall goal was less destructive towards people's faith per se, and it didn't have the same kind of straw man built into the premises for it. It was just how to have impossible conversations with people, and it goes back to using this same kind of methodology of asking people questions to have them expand on things and to being able to empathize with the viewpoint, even if you may disagree with it, but being able to step into their shoes a little bit. So hopefully he's grown a little bit in that regard, at least.
Yeah, I think the idea of labeling people who say that they have faith as psychotic is probably a bridge too far. I respect his right to have an opinion, but that's just a little too Orwellian for me. But I've had
right, and if I could be wrong here, but if I recall correctly, in that book, which was not, I guess, a direct follow-up, but he did express some regret, it seemed, over coming on too strong on some of these things in an attacking manner with people. I have to go back and read it again. But yeah.
That was one thing that struck me in this book, is that he spent a good portion of at least one chapter stressing that you don't take an aggressive or pugilistic sort of approach, that you try to be gentle and gracious and everything. So he almost did a 1 Peter 3:16 315 thing where he's talking about gentleness and respect, and I was like, whoa, I have yet to meet a street epistemologist who's taken his advice, and
Right, right.
I am really going to have to save that section of the book and bounce it back in the face of these street epistemologists that I've run into, because they are not gentle and respectful and all of the things that he's suggesting that they do be.
No, most of the ones I've seen definitely haven't been, and it brings up this element of deception too. If you're intentionally using a straw man in such a way, I mean, you are intentionally being deceptive to someone in this methodology behind this whole process. It may be a good one. It may be a good one to get people to think, but at the core, it's still being deceptive by strawmanning their beliefs and then handing them that straw man to play with,
Yeah, definitely, allow a person to tell you what they believe rather than telling them what they believe.
Right, right. I've engaged in something that's, I guess, somewhere between street epistemology and street evangelism. In that I've went out to various events and just handed out waters, and then just had conversations with people. So we'd have a survey that would just have basic questions of what religious belief do you, or what belief system do you follow? How'd you come to that conclusion? And a number of questions that kind of follow this same pattern, to just have a genuine good conversation with someone. Of course, the goal is to be able to talk about maybe more things about their religious belief, to build a conversation with somebody, even as a stranger, where you can have, this level of conversation that you usually only get to once you've developed a relationship longer with somebody. And so going out and having these same kind of conversations with strangers, which is I must say, it's very enjoyable in being able to do that and have good conversations with people. But again, this is somewhere in between, because I'm actually there to listen and learn and hear what people have to say, because I want to understand where they're coming from. If we get to the point where I can tell them why I believe what I do, great. But not every conversation gets there, because sometimes people have a lot of baggage they want to unpack about things, and that's okay. I'm there to listen and want to have those kind of conversations, and that's the kind of thing I respected about Boghossian's book on conversations. Was I think it's great that we can have those type of things. But I always see with street epistemology such a train track laid path, rather than kind of forging this path of conversation through untamed woods. It's kind of more laid out like a train in terms of step 1, step 2, step 3, with this set goal in mind of reducing someone's confidence in what they believe.
Yeah. No, I mean, in the book, he talks about, if we can get all of these people mobilized, we'll have an army of street epistemologists out there combating this disease of faith. I mean, these are his words. He doesn't hold back. He gets pretty aggressive in his desire to eradicate faith from society. And I suppose if you accept his definition of faith and arrive at the same, conclusions about faith and its effects that he did, I can't blame him for
Right,
being so
right.
concerned about it. I just think he's arrived at the wrong conclusions about faith. I can't tell. I don't see anything in his biography that would suggest that he was once a Christian himself, but he may have been. I don't know. His behavior is the kinds of things you see from people who used to be Christian and deconverted. So I
Right.
wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, but I don't remember reading anything or seeing him speak on anything that suggests that he used to be Christian.
Yeah, I can't seem to recall offhand either. Yeah, I'm not finding anything directly either.
Mm-hmm. Now,
No, not sure on that.
the guy that did the prologue to his book was deconvert, and it was one that I profiled, and now I can't remember who it was, but that's all right. That's not important.
What I do find interesting is, and this is something I greatly respect about Boghossian, is that not only his passion for things, but he will go after anybody he believes is out of left field. And did you ever read any about his academic research papers that were put into these various schools for being published in these academic journals? But what it was is they built false papers that were
Oh,
completely
yeah, yeah, yeah.
fabricated,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I remember this
and
story.
dumped them into critical theory type classes and
Yeah. Okay.
organizations, and saw how
Yeah.
many of them were accepted by the academic journals.
I forgot about that until you brought that up. But yeah, he does spend um, a chapter or two in his book talking about sort of the spiral that academia has taken into sort of this progressive um, mindset that is in itself somewhat fundamentalist and um, Orwellian in the fact that it disallows a variety of opinion or any kind of divergence in thought, and so he actually took an approach that not many atheists take, which was sort of against this radical progressivism, at least in uh, instances of deconversion. You see them moving towards the radical progressive left. So the fact that he stood up against something that is otherwise fairly prominent in atheism was a bit surprising.
That's interesting. Yeah, that is different. I remember we've talked about that before.
Yeah. Have have I ever gone into the concept of leftward drift?
I was
I'm,
getting ready to say leftward drift. So
yeah, I'm
yeah,
sure I
yeah,
have.
we've covered that a little bit.
That's a thing that I've talked about because it's very consistent across the board. I don't think I've ever run into a convert that hasn't gone from being radically right wing politically to radically left wing politically at the point of their deconversion.
Hmm.
I can't name a single interview on a person's deconversion that didn't contain a substantial amount of political discussion related to how bad right wing policies are and how great left wing policies are. Mostly how bad right wing policies are. That's the focus
Right.
really on how terrible fundamentalist Christian evangelical right wingers are.
Well, yeah, everybody's better at burning their opponent to the ground than they are about building their own side up.
I don't know if that's necessarily true
It's
because
true.
most worldviews that I know of, when they try to convince somebody um, of the truth of their worldview, do so by advocating for their worldview more so than attacking the other person's worldview. Meaning that, hey, I know what you have seems good, but here's something better. And then talk about the advantages of what you're offering. That's certainly what's done in street evangelism. There's
Right.
less of a concentration on where you're coming from than there is, here is a better position for you to be at. Um, versus atheism, which doesn't offer a great alternative to religion. It simply spends all of its time talking about how terrible religion is. And so it's not a coaxing in my direction. It's a you must reject the thing you currently have. So, I mean the Christian equivalent would be if the person's house is burning down, you offer them a better house, versus the atheist who says, "Okay, your house is burning down, run naked into the night. Good luck. Let me tell you how bad your house is burning down. Listen to me for a second here.
Ooh.
That is a really badly burning house. I would get out of there."
That may be the funniest moment we've ever had on here. That's a pretty good one. I like that.
Yep. So that's what I got for you, Caleb.
All right. Well, I think I've said everything I had to say as we went along. I can't recall anything else specifically, at least immediately, to the direct conversation that would carry us any further without just dragging this thing out too long. So,
yeah.
But I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on it, especially how it relates to your research. That's interesting.
Yeah. Boghossian didn't get too political, which is unusual. Aside from critiquing the kind of radical progressiveness in academia, other than that, he suggested that churches get taxed, but he didn't spend a lot of time talking about politics, which is unusual.
Yeah. It's interesting. The more I read by him, the more respect I do have for him as an individual. Aside from some of these things, like this straw man of faith he's put out, but aside from things like that, I think he's a very intelligent guy, and is certainly somebody who's interested in having conversations with people, which is something I can certainly admire, because I think we as Christians could learn a lot from that in terms of how we have conversations with people. And, it certainly can be a therapeutic process, even just to have a conversation with someone, even if they are of different viewpoints, as long as you can have that conversation gracefully.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, I mean, he's a good conversationalist, and he's dedicated to what he does. So I don't mean to demean the man in any way, shape, or form. I think that he's sort of sincere about what he believes and the advantages of what he thinks he's doing. But I don't think he's as willing to listen to opposing points of view as he supposes that he is.
Right. No, and I think that's fair criticism. And I think you've done a fair job presenting his view here. I don't think you've just thrown all the darts you could at it and not explained kind of where he's coming from. So certainly all adds up to me anyway.
Yep. All right. So you ready to swing us out of here?
Yeah. So, Joel, let's talk about where people can find additional content.
Sure. So, The Mentionables is one of the largest things that I do, and therefore the Mentionables website is thementionables.com. Org. thementionables.org. And you can follow us on Twitter at The Mentionables. And we're on Facebook. You're just going to have to search for The Mentionables on Facebook. There aren't that many groups named The Mentionables out there. Really, there's 3. One was a sort of a pop rock band from the 2000s. One is a line of lingerie, very tasteful, and the other is us.
We could do one of those calendars at some point. You know the kind.
Yeah.
Maybe we can even get a sponsorship.
Ooh.
See, there we go. It's the worst idea I've ever had.
All right. So I'm Joel Furchess. My website is joelfurchess.com.
All right.
You can follow my research, and I have my art there as well.
art. You're a man of many talents.
Don't like to brag, but yeah, I am.
Excellent, excellent.
Hey, we have a visitor.
Oh, yay. Let's see what's going on. Look who showed up. We were just telling people a little while ago, well, at the start of the show, about your recent debate, so we gave you a shout out when you weren't even here.
Yeah.
So there you go, Clinton. Hope you've had a safe move. We'll be looking forward to having you back on.
Now, see, I was hoping he had an unsafe move, but now I feel bad about my position.
Yeah. So, and place listeners can find more content. I get on and have some conversations with people, with some other co-hosts over at Question Christianity. So you can check that out. And yeah, so that and right here on the Mentionables. The one with Chris Date, that is right. All right, still getting settled. Well, we'll be glad to see you back on here with us next time. So,
yeah, absolutely, and you will be. You will.
You're here in spirit tonight. So, at least your small mini thumbnail picture is.
Yeah, and we talked about Star Trek without you. No, we didn't.
No.
There was no mention of Star Trek.
Not this time. Well, now there is.
Yeah, there we go.
You just negated that. So great. All right. Well, I think that's it. I think we've killed it pretty good.
Yeah, we've definitely killed something.
Now, if we drag it through the mud a little bit longer, like old Tripod, then
poor Tripod.
Yeah. So, all right. I'm rolling the outro now. Have a good night, everybody.